Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director. We're back after a short break, and what a year it is that lies ahead. 2024 has been called the year of elections, more than 2 billion people going to the polls in more than 50 countries, and this week we're going to be looking at one such vote in one of the world's most sensitive geopolitical flashpoints, that is Taiwan. This weekend, Taiwan goes to the polls with the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, currently the front runner. And we're going to talk about what's at stake in these elections for those living there, but also beyond the island too. We're going to talk about whether this demonstration of democracy is likely to trigger more aggression from China, which claims Taiwan as part of its territory, and what role the US and other countries play in all these calculations. We're starting 2024 with some terrific guests. Joining me down the line from Taipei is Swedish journalist Jojje Olsson. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Also from Nottingham, a bit closer to Chatham House's headquarters, is Dr. Chun-Yi Lee. She is the director of the Taiwan Research Hub at the University of Nottingham. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
And in the Chatham House studio is Ben Bland, the director of our Asia Pacific program. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Bronwen. Great to be with you again.
Great to have you here. Well, let's start off with this first question of why Taiwan's election result matters so much, obviously to Taiwan, but also to the world. Ben, I wondered if you could start us off with the basics of who is running in the election and what are the positions of the candidates.
Thanks, Bronwen. So there are three candidates. It's a three-horse race, which is quite rare in Taiwan to have a competitive three-horse race and makes the race quite unpredictable. Under Taiwan law, you're not actually allowed to discuss the specifics of polling and 10 days out from the election. But the front runner before that period was Lai Ching-te, who's the current vice president from the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. He's going up against Hou Yu-ih from the Kuomintang, which was the kind of long-time ruling single-party ruler of Taiwan. And then there's a third insurgent new party, the Taiwan People's Party, led by a former doctor called Jojje. People often talk about the DPP as being sort of pro-independence and the other parties having a different stance. But in my perspective, looking at it from afar, actually all three main candidates say that they want Taiwan's future to be decided by Taiwan's 23 million people on a democratic basis. They all say they want to maintain the de facto independence that Taiwan has, whatever they call it. And they all say that they want to invest more in defense so that Taiwan can deter any threats from China. But there are differences in how they say they would approach Beijing, and I'm sure that Jojje and Chun-Yi can speak to that in more detail.
Chun-Yi, what do you make of that particular point of whether there are really significant differences in their attitude to China?
Well, this is a good question and point. Supposedly, DPP's position should be more far away from China than the KMT, as the KMT was more of a pro-China party from history. TPP is a new party. We don't know exactly what's their position. They have been possibly to run the joint ticket with the KMT at the end of November, but they didn't actually come into a joint ticket. So in that sense, both KMT and DPP so far have been expressed that they want Taiwan's future to be decided by the Taiwanese people and not to be influenced by China. And I think it is clear for the DPP, the current governing party, to say so. But it is a little bit struggling or difficult for the KMT to express such a position because of the baggage that KMT used to have. So I think KMT was trying to reform itself or trying to clean their image to be the close friend with China, but not really successful because we don't know exactly whether they are or they are not close to China. But we're clear that DPP is very clearly wanted to be cut off from the Chinese influence.
It's fascinating as you both describe it. Some clear points there, but also some points of mystery about what is the central question of this. You're in Taipei. What are people feeling about this? How are they discussing this election?
Yes, I think an important difference here between DPP and KMT is that the DPP is promoting a Taiwanese identity, whereas KMT is promoting a Chinese identity. And that is something that has become very important in this election as the threat from China is increasing. So, of course, the big election issue is the cross-strait relation. And here we have something called 1992 consensus, which was a consensus made by KMT and the Chinese Communist Party, so they could start economic cooperation in the early 90s. And this consensus says that China and Taiwan is part of the same nation with different interpretations. But DPP, in the past 8 years when they had power, they don't acknowledge this consensus, whereas KMT do acknowledge it, and they would acknowledge it again if they retook the power. So it really has become a question of not only Chinese threat towards Taiwan, but also, are you promoting a Chinese or Taiwanese identity? Do you feel Chinese, Taiwanese, or both? And then, of course, we have TPP, who tries to be in the middle, who tries to be well above this ideologic fighting of the two other parties. And they say that they want to be more pragmatic in the cross-strait relations, but it's really hard to kind of define what they really want. So they just try to, basically, it feels like they want to avoid talking cross-strait relations and focus on domestic issues. But the feeling on the ground, to sum it up, is that China, again, in the past week or so, has really become, again, the most important issue of this election.
So, Ben, can you tease out for us how much this matters, this election? I mean, every Taiwan election comes with a kind of focus on these issues, quite a bit of tension around it. But how much does this one matter?
Well, I think there are three main reasons why it matters. I mean, first, we shouldn't forget it matters to the 23 million people who live in Taiwan, and that's often overlooked when we talk about Taiwan. But it's a growing economy, it's a high-tech economy. If it was acknowledged as a full country by the rest of the world, it would almost be on the edge of being in the G20. So it's a significant country. So I think it matters to Taiwanese people. I think secondly, it matters as a democratic success story for the most part, because I think whatever you say about the three candidates, it's highly likely that the result will be accepted by the losers, and losers' consent has not necessarily been the norm in much bigger democracies in other parts of the world. So I think it's really a success story of democratic transition. This will be the eighth presidential election, and Taiwan has moved from being an authoritarian state led by the KMT to being a competitive multi-party democracy. I think we shouldn't overlook that. But of course, the last point, which is the one that everyone talks about, is the geopolitics of it all. And I think there will be significant implications depending on which candidate is chosen. I think China will increase the pressure on Taiwan, whoever wins, to be clear, but the pressure will likely take different forms. If it's the DPP, it's likely to be more of the kind of military-style coercion, more tests of missiles that fly over or near Taiwan, more flights by military aircraft around Taiwan. I think if it's going to be potentially the TPP or KMT, you're going to see political pressure to enter some sort of talks with China on probably an unequal basis that is designed to undermine the autonomy, the self-government that Taiwan has. And that does have implications given Taiwan's linkages both to China, obviously, as a main point of threat, and the US as, an unclear defender of Taiwan with, commitments to provide means of self-defense to Taiwan. We don't know what that means in practice, but obviously it sits at the heart of this, growing tension between the US and China.
It's really interesting the way you put it, that the status quo probably doesn't persist, in a sense, that China will react in some way, either by pushing for closer links or with more demonstrations of aggression, whatever they mean. Chun-Yi, is that how you see it? That this really is something of a turning, well, not quite turning point, but a development. We're going to have a change depending on who wins and how China chooses to react to that.
We were going to have a change, but I don't really think that status quo will change. So the change is, as Ben indicated, that it might be China's reaction towards different winners who enter the presidential office. DPP may have more militant reaction. I would also suggest that China threatened Taiwan if DPP came into the presidential office, they will cut off the ECFA. So both military and economic coercion, that is more obvious. If the KMT or TPP entered the presidential office, maybe less likely. But as a whole, I still think that the status quo maintained for the reason that it is just a slightly different reaction towards the next presidential office holders. But it still maintains the status quo, which is different interpretation of one China in that sense. So I don't really think that it would have a really major difference, like military invention towards Taiwan if DPP candidates came into the presidential office, for the reason that, let's say the third reason, Ben just mentioned, the geopolitical dynamic. It doesn't really look very favorable if China intended to take any military invention on Taiwan for the global geopolitical dynamic at this stage. And I think Xi Jinping and his Politburo has been calculating, has been thinking about that, but they felt that it's probably not the right time, both internationally and domestically, with their domestic pressures and crises, as far as we can observe from afar. So my answer would be, it is a general status quo, but it will be a minor change of different candidates entering the presidential offices.
Bronwen, if I could just come in on this question, because I think it's an important one. If we take a step back, if we talk about the status quo as Taiwan maintaining autonomy, self-government, de facto independence, that's one thing. But we shouldn't confuse that for the situation being static, because Taiwan is changing. As Jojje said, this sense of a separate identity in Taiwan has really been consolidated and cohering, and that's connected to the democracy. China is changing, becoming more assertive, even aggressive under Xi Jinping. And the relationship between the US and China, US and Taiwan, Europe and Taiwan is changing too. So while there's the status quo in terms of the kind of system of governance, actually so much is changing around that. And so there isn't some sort of Taiwan we can preserve in aspic because everything is changing on all different sides of this very complex problem.
That is a much better way of putting it than I did. Not static, and all of this is changing. But it sounds like the two of you agree that you think that China at this point is not contemplating a military action against Taiwan or real invasion or something. Ben, this is a line I think you've taken for a long time, even if the DPP wins. Is that right, Ben?
In as much as, we can ever know, and even in democracies, people don't usually start wars for rational reasons, because you wouldn't start a war in most cases. But as far as we can tell, and not least now, we know that the PLA, the Chinese military, has a lot of corruption and other issues. So I don't think many people, even, in the Pentagon, who look at these things very closely, would expect a hard military response to a DPP election win. That's not something that most people are thinking about.
It will make Taiwan's international space more difficult for sure if DPP wins, but we don't expect that would be a hard military attack. I would say I think they are contemplating, they are considering, but when they would make a move, probably not now. So they're still always thinking to take Taiwan. There's always a possibility for the CCP to take Taiwan with military force and never drop that line. But when is the time? We don't think it will be the time for the next presidential elections outcome to come out.
Jojje, what's the reaction in Taiwan to this kind of calculation, which everyone must have in their mind, a lot of the time, two different visions of the future, one working towards more closeness with China, one having to deal with possibly quite a lot of obstruction in the seas around, making Taiwan's life much more difficult, as Chun-Yi was just saying, with at the end of that, conceivably a military invasion. How do people deal with this in making their decisions of their daily lives?
Yeah, it's interesting because this election has been framed by the opposition as an election between war and peace, meaning that if DPP continue to rule, the risk for a Chinese attack is increasing. And then the government, the DPP, they have been framing it as an election between democracy and authoritarianism. And that means that it's dangerous to move closer to China in a time when China's claims on Taiwan is becoming increasingly aggressive. And I think most people here would also look at it in a kind of short and long-term perspective. So what happens most likely if KMT takes the power? They will restart the dialogue with China because they will agree on the 1992 consensus. So that means in the short term, you will have less military threats, less fighter jets in Taiwan's air identification zone. But in the long term, a lot of people are worried that Taiwan's democratic rights will be hollowed out, just as was the case in Hong Kong. Because last election, which I was also here covering, Hong Kong became a big issue because you could see that the Hong Kong democracy movement was being crushed. The protests there was being crushed at the same time as Taiwan had an election. And then if you see in the long run, so that means that if DPP continues to rule, in the short term, you will have more military tension, and the dialogue with China will not be reopened. But at the same time, many people will see it as a kind of guarantee, if you will, that Chinese influence will not do the same to Taiwan, what happened to Hong Kong. And then just to add to this point, how people are thinking about this issue, people are actually here quite used to Chinese threats. So they don't really see, it's nothing that you think about during your daily life. But something really interesting happened here just 2 days ago when I was in a press conference with Foreign Minister Joseph Wu. There was a warning message on everyone's phones saying that the Chinese missile was being launched over Taiwan. And then it turned out that this warning message was mistranslated. It was actually only debris from a rocket that was carrying a satellite. But because it was mistranslated during a press conference, it got a lot of attention from all the journalists there. And this actually also became quite big national news. And that's a reminder of that the China issue is always in the background. And then we have also seen in the past week or so, there has been tens of balloons, air balloons, Chinese air balloons, like the one you had over continental US last winter, has been flying also over Taiwan. And that is also a new situation.
These are thought to be spy balloons.
Spy balloons.
These are not little party balloons for children.
They say it's weather balloons.
Yeah, weather balloon, exactly. They are so used to Chinese jets in the vicinity, in the air identification zone. So China now, before the election, they have to try some new methods to influence the outcome.
Chun-Yi, how are younger Taiwanese regarding all this? I'm thinking of reports that you read every now and then of a lot of younger Taiwanese. This is not our problem. Going to study in China, being curious about it, less bothered by all this.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to also say that it is interesting to see that Taiwanese voters knew that probably vote for the DPP or not vote for the KMT would result in a more hardship situation. However, it seems not decrease their support to the DPP or to a party which is far away from China. And this is also coming back to your point, Bronwen, that the younger generation, they are a generation suffered from not able to afford their houses, no matter how hard they work, because their monthly salary is just so little. And they are suffered, also endures this kind of high inflation. And yet, I think they wanted to have more of their own identity, more of their own sovereignty, in a sense, not to be absorbed by the Chinese orbits in many ways. And I think this is interesting phenomenon to see. In the past or in the 2020 election, Han Kuo-yu or their campaign was using the economic incentive to be closer to China to attract votes. That worked to the point, I think either Bang or Jojje was mentioned about 2019, the Hong Kong crashed down the national security law. Taiwanese voters saw there would be a very harsh or very bleak future. They don't want it to end up like Hong Kong. And it suddenly changed the dynamic of the votes. And Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, 4 years ago, won a landscape victory because of that kind of the change. So I was just thinking that it's brave, if you like, I put in this way, for the Taiwanese voters, especially younger generation. They knew that they're going to endure more hardship economic-wise, and probably the missile throwing across the Taiwan Straits, balloons, tons of balloons. And yet they are not really wanting to be closer to China. So I think that is a point that is interesting to be observed.
It's a really important point. I wonder, in an odd way, Ben, if you could pick this up and just take us into our second question, the wider question of tension in the region, how other countries, South Korea, Japan, are looking at these elections, but also the question of Chinese assertiveness in the seas around all these countries, and what we should make of China's undeniable assertiveness, how worried everyone should be.
Well, what always surprises me is how many countries in Asia just bury their head in the sand, to be honest, on Taiwan. I think the PRC has done a really good job of persuading other countries that it's too risky to talk about Taiwan, to even think about it. So if you look across the region, you'd probably think Australia is watching it quite closely. Obviously, Japan. Their nearest island, Yonaguni, is just 70 miles off Taiwan. South Korea a bit, Singapore, because of some of their historic links and cultural links and the like. I mean, much of the rest of the region is just trying to ignore it, look the other way, even though there are hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians, for example, from Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, living, working in Taiwan. But I think governments and others, even civil society, feel it's just too toxic, too risky to say anything or think anything about Taiwan because the Chinese embassy will be on the phone or calling you in. So it clearly does have massive implications for security, for democracy, for the future of the region. But I think, for much of the region, apart from those countries I mentioned at the start, they would just sort of look at it as an idiosyncratic case. They basically accept China's claim largely that Taiwan is part of China. And so they see it as a sort of sovereignty question rather than a regional security question. I mean, I think they're wrong in that. But I can understand why developing countries with lots of other challenges and big economic relationships with China choose to look the other way.
Chun-Yi, you're nodding as Ben was talking. Do you agree with that? And with the point that perhaps they're wrong to ignore China's assertiveness and just treat this as a one-off case?
I do. And in many cases that I realize that the countries dislike or against or hostile to China or discontent with China does not necessarily translate it to their support to Taiwan. This is across the global country, I would say. So not just Southeast Asia countries, but globally in many ways. And I wonder, this is a question I wonder why, and I couldn't really get to the answer. So countries, for instance, like Ben just mentioned, Southeast Asia country, both, in my understanding, actually Vietnam was pretty much against China due to the South China Sea situation, but they don't necessarily wanted to touch this hot water or hot potato, if you like, of Taiwan. And I don't really quite get into the understanding why. Again, I can't blame any countries why they don't do this. I feel that it must be having their own national interest and consideration. What I can say is, I can see very clearly their discontent with China and their support to Taiwan do not match. And what can we draw from there is the support for Taiwan amounts little to any country's national interest. Because if you think from their perspective, why would they support little island of Taiwan, which is, from my perspective, sad, from a scholar's perspective, understood, because that is their national interest. This is not right, I totally agree, but it's a very cruel reality. And I think that I just wanted to point this out, that is the case.
Yeah, when you're within Taiwan, that sense of other countries not really being prepared to defend it, even close neighbors, does that feel very isolated, or is it covered up by a veneer of diplomacy and professions of support?
Yeah, well, the Taiwanese government is always very careful to underline that it's our own responsibility to defend our country. So I think even though most of the people, they expect at least the United States to come to help if there is really a Chinese attack, there is also signs that, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that the Taiwanese authorities and the civil society, they have started to take the question of defense and civil defense much, much more serious. So that's for sure. But then you can also see that China's behavior in the region has alienated a lot of other countries. And of course, the smaller countries, they don't really want to get into an argument with China over Taiwan. But when Nancy Pelosi was here, for instance, in the summer of 2022, the US Representative House Speaker, there was a massive Chinese military exercises as a response. And then you had a couple of Chinese missiles who landed in the Japanese economic zone on the northeast of Taiwan. And that also made Japan to beef up their preparedness for some kind of conflict in the region, because Japan will almost inevitably be dragged into a conflict, given that you have tens of thousands of US Marines stationed in Japan, and those bases would be used. And then you also have, of course, AUKUS, the defense pact between Australia and US and UK, which after this was agreed upon that Australia is going to get submarines with American and British technology. You also can hear the Australian defense minister saying that it's unthinkable that Australia would not fight together with the US if there was a conflict over Taiwan or with China. So sure, you can see that many countries are actually getting in line of preparedness thanks to the alliance building we have seen from the US in the past few years. But there is also an understanding in Taiwan that we have to be responsible for defending our own country.
Ben, this is a picture of kind of US-led alliances being formed. And thank you, Jojje. I was just going to ask you about AUKUS, which Britain obviously makes a part, though I personally am rather sceptical that Britain is in a position to contribute a lot militarily to that. But Ben, what weight do these alliances put on support from others in the region, Japan, South Korea, who, as we've been describing, might be loath personally to get involved in a fight over Taiwan?
I think it's really a case-by-case basis. I mean, given Japan's proximity to Taiwan, I think it's a very different case from South Korea. Also, obviously, given how Japan thinks about China compared to how sort of South Korean governments tend to think about China, and the fact that they have another big China-linked security problem in North Korea. So I think it really is a case-by-case basis. But I don't think we should be too critical of regional countries that don't say much, because to be honest, the UK doesn't say much, the European Union doesn't say much, and the US position itself is ambiguous. Often they'll say deliberately, but it is unclear. So I think you will just have to see if something really bad happens. You'll only find out then. Which alliances matter. But for Japan, it's a question of proximity. I think for other regional partners, it's proximity, but they're non-aligned, so they're not going to do anything. But I think really you only find out when terrible things happen. Before that, it's all quite academic, and there's this sort of shadow boxing game of deterrence and strategic ambiguity and all this kind of stuff. So it is really hard to unpick.
The point being that China would only find out at that point as well whether these alliances counted for anything.
Exactly.
Chun-Yi, Taiwan has been doing more, particularly at US urging, to build up its own defenses. Can you just take us a bit into what it's been doing militarily?
Yes, in that sense, the military budget has been increased. Jojje must know as well. And also the civilians military service is increased from 4 months currently to a year after the new president entered the office, which will be this year, May, I think. In many ways, that is definitely important because one country needs to defend ourselves rather than relying on other countries to defend for us. So this is important that Taiwan has had more of the awareness of training our young people to be prepared in case any bad things happen. The readiness for war, let's put it very blankly, the readiness for war is increased. Awareness for war is gradually prepared among the generations or among the people in Taiwan. But one other thing I wanted to a little bit divert from this really conventional thought of the war and security. I think actually Taiwan is also doing by building their network with other countries instead of thinking of other countries, the dependence on China. For instance, as we also knew that the semiconductor, Taiwan has been working hard, has been producing the number one advanced chips in the world, and Taiwan has been investing to other countries, the TSMC. So the core points from my perspective is if we only judge from Taiwan's readiness for war or security capacity, Taiwan would never, ever be able to compete with China. That's really clear. However, Taiwan is building its impossible to be replaced in the world through other means. And I see that is a very encouraging phenomenon for Taiwan.
That's a really important point. The TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, has been called the world's most important company in Taiwan, obviously trying to protect that capacity, and other countries trying to protect that capacity to get those chips. We're speaking in a year not just of lots of elections, but quite a lot of live wars. I'm thinking, of course, of Ukraine and Israel, Hamas in Gaza, though there have been many others in the past year and others threatening to catch light again. Do these have any bearing on the tension over Taiwan? Ben, I wonder if you could just muse on this for a moment. China is obviously very keen to say there was no relevance at all, and each of these have different principles and no questions of sovereignty here because Taiwan is part of China and so on. But there's a tendency to discuss them all separately, and yet these are resonant and the attempts to solve them affect each other.
Yeah, most certainly. When I was in Taiwan last year, I mean, it's something I talked a lot about to different people, and there were many different perspectives, especially on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, as you say, there are many differences, but there are a lot of interconnections too. Not least the ability and willingness of US and US allies to sort of fund or support conflicts in different places at the same time. Just the sheer reminder that adventurous invasions of other territories are, still possible in our world, which is maybe something we don't like to think about. So I think there are lots of knock-on implications in many ways. Obviously, the Chinese military and Chinese government are looking at some of the military lessons they might be able to learn, albeit very different, physical characteristics of Ukraine and Taiwan. So there are lots of factors. I guess the other thing is just burnout amongst sort of publics and the media about sort of conflicts around the world, because we don't seem to be able to have it as human beings in our minds. As a former journalist, I can say this, and our media is guilty of this too, to think about more than one conflict at the same time. So I think those are all factors that are going to play into the sort of calculus of publics, of governments, of militaries when they're thinking about the Taiwan question.
I'm going to rush in and say, of course, Chatham House can think about many wars and conflicts and problems at the same time. But Jojje, does it feel like the example of Ukraine and in a way of the destruction going on in Gaza, does those points, those examples of the difficulty of war, do you think that acts as a deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, here in Taiwan, saying that today Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan has become very, very common. Because, just as Ben said, this is the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine is an example that the wars can actually happen today. And there is a clear connection, obviously, between the war in Ukraine and Taiwan's situation, which you can see, for instance, that Taiwan, a lot of weapon sales from the US has been delayed to Taiwan because the weapons are going instead to Ukraine. And when it comes to European Union, the stocks of a lot of artillery, ammunition, and other equipment is also depleted, and it will be very difficult for Taiwan to get help from anywhere else. And I also, as a journalist, I can also really say that, especially in smaller European countries, that what happened in Ukraine and now in Gaza, it takes the light away from Taiwan's situation. Many medias have a hard time to hold more than one foreign policy issue in the discussion at the same time. And then you have Ukraine as number one, and then you have Middle East as number two, and then Taiwan is going down the list at the same time as the situation is actually getting more serious here. So yeah, the connection is very clear, and it's very worrying situation.
You put it very well. We're coming right to the end of this. So Ben, I wondered if you could just pick up this point. Taiwan's moving down the list, and yet if there were, for example, Chinese real move on Taiwan, US chose to intervene, a conflict between the US and China is the catastrophe the world does not want to contemplate and would dwarf these other things that we've been talking about. What is your assessment now, speaking in January, of the risk of that catastrophe?
I think, as the risk of sort of invasion of choice anytime soon seems low. But I think what you have to worry about is as this the reality on the ground changes, it becomes more and more obvious that the Taiwanese people will never opt, as far as we can tell, to, by choice, to be part of China. That means if Xi Jinping is serious about integrating and taking Taiwan, it has to be through coercion. That may not just be an invasion, but increasing kind of the noose around Taiwan. And as they do that, the risk of miscalculation increases, particularly at a time when US-China relations are bad and they've restored some level of military to military communication, but there's still not much trust there at all. So it's about few good options, rising tensions, and growing risk of miscalculation. And that is how many wars in the past have started, not because the leader sits there and says, today is the day, but it's this circle of sort of distrust, miscalculation, accident. And that is extremely worrying.
Chun-Yi, I'm going to give the last word to you, your assessment of that.
Well, I think it really depends on, again, I agree, Ben's assessment as well, but also emphasize on the importance to look into the Taiwanese people's willingness, which we will see more after the presidential election. And it is important to see this is a democracy and has a legitimate election results, and then the war shouldn't annoy these points. Agree that China would always not abandon this idea of a military invention. However, what can we all do about that? This is the point. And I think that we should not ignore the democracy and the people's willingness. And this is the important thing that we always uphold to.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And with that, we're going to have to stop for now. But we will obviously cover in detail what happens in Taiwan and even more importantly, from Chatham House's point of view, what you should make of it, what the world should make of it. So a big thank you to my guests, Chun-Yi Lee, Jojje Olsson, and Ben Bland. Do follow them all on Twitter. We're still not quite calling it X, not every time. The links will be in the show notes. There is so much going on at the moment, as I said at the start, elections in more than 50 countries, consequences beyond their borders, many live conflicts, including in Gaza and Ukraine, as well as new economic realities that are making real demands on leaders, some of those leaders heading for the polls this year. I'll be looking at all these challenges and setting out ways to approach them in my annual director's lecture on the 23rd of January. Do come and watch. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, and subscribe. Do leave us a review. We really love that, whatever you say. To read more from our experts or to find out more about our events, and we're just rolling out the year's fantastic program, which includes my director's lecture, don't forget to visit chathamhouse.org, where you can follow the work of all our programs, including our Asia Pacific program that we have just been discussing. So that's it for this week, and until next time, goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox.